In the spring of 1944, several German prisoners inside an American camp made a decision that confused their guards and alarmed their own officers because when they were ordered to report for medical treatment, they refused to step forward not out of pride or defiance, but because they believed the treatment itself was a hidden form of punishment that would cost them their dignity, their strength, or their lives. They had survived capture, transport, and weeks behind barbed wire. Yet it was a clean white infirmary, quiet corridors, and American doctors speaking calmly that finally made them stop and say no, because in their world, enemy medicine was never meant to heal, and accepting it felt less like care and more like surrender. What none of them understood was that a single rule, written far from the camp and enforced without emotion, was about to turn their refusal into a moment that quietly rewrote everything they believed about captivity, obedience, and survival. By the time the German prisoners were marched toward the infirmary for the first time, the camp had already settled into a rhythm that felt unsettlingly calm. Because captivity in America did not resemble the chaos they had prepared themselves for, but instead unfolded through schedules, lists, and rules enforced with a quiet consistency that left little room for dramatic cruelty, yet offered no comfort either. The infirmary itself stood near the edge of the compound, a low wooden building painted white, its windows screened, its door marked with a red cross that many of the prisoners avoided looking at directly, not out of superstition, but because symbols had lost their meaning somewhere between propaganda and defeat. Most of the men walking in that line had minor injuries, infections that would have gone untreated at the front, fevers that lingered after weeks of malnutrition, cuts that never fully closed, teeth that ached constantly, joints swollen from forced marches and cold nights. Yet none of these pains felt as dangerous to them as the idea of being examined by enemy doctors. In their training, medicine was never neutral because it belonged to the state, to ideology, to control, and accepting treatment from an enemy meant placing your body entirely in their hands, trusting that they would not weaken you further, experiment on you, or mark you in ways that would follow you long after the war was over. The guards noticed the hesitation immediately. The line slowed, then stopped entirely, as several prisoners lowered their eyes and refused to step forward when their names were called. There was no shouting, no sudden violence, only a long moment of confusion in which neither side seemed certain how to proceed. An American medic glanced toward an officer, expecting an order that never came, while the prisoners exchanged brief looks that carried more fear than defiance. Because refusal was not an act of rebellion here, but a last attempt to retain control over something that still felt theirs. Word spread quickly through the barracks that medical treatment was optional, or at least appeared to be, and by that evening dozens of men were debating what the white building truly represented. Some argued that refusing treatment was foolish, that sickness weakened a man faster than any enemy ever could, while others insisted that whatever waited inside those walls could not be trusted, because no captor invested resources in the health of men they intended to break. Older prisoners, veterans of earlier campaigns, spoke quietly about camps in the East, about medical inspections that ended in selections, about doctors whose instruments served ideology rather than healing. And although those stories did not belong to America, fear does not respect geography, and memory travels faster than reason. The camp administration recorded the refusals without comment. Names were written down, files updated, and the infirmary remained open, lights on, supplies untouched, as if waiting patiently for a decision that would come on its own time. No punishments followed, no rations were cut, no threats were issued, which only deepened the prisoners' unease, because uncertainty is far more unsettling than force, and silence often feels like preparation for something worse. That night, lying on narrow bunks beneath the dull glow of barracks lights, many of the men realized that their refusal had changed something intangible but important. because for the first time since capture, they were not reacting to violence, but to restraint, and they did not yet know how to interpret it. They wondered whether this was a test of obedience, a psychological trap, or simply another unfamiliar rule in a system that operated according to laws they had never been taught. What they could not see was that the decision they believed was theirs alone was already intersecting with a rule far older and far stronger than the camp itself, a rule that did not care about fear, pride, or belief, and that would soon force an outcome none of them had anticipated. The refusals did not end after the first day, and that alone unsettled the camp authorities more than open defiance ever could, because the system they operated under was designed to respond to disobedience, not hesitation. Each morning, the infirmary list was posted again, and each morning several names remained unmarked, untouched by check marks or signatures, as if those men existed in a space the paperwork did not quite know how to handle. The prisoners noticed this immediately, because in a camp ruled by schedules, anything that disrupted routine felt significant, and significance always carried risk. Inside the barracks, the conversations grew quieter and more deliberate. Men spoke in low voices, careful not to attract attention, replaying the same questions again and again, asking whether refusing treatment marked them as troublemakers, whether their names were now flagged in files they would never see, whether the calm response itself was the warning. Some began to reconsider their decision, not because they trusted the infirmary, but because uncertainty gnawed at them more persistently than pain. A fever could be endured, a wound could be ignored, but not knowing what the camp intended to do next hollowed out sleep and made every footstep outside sound like an approach. Those who did enter the infirmary returned with stories that only deepened the confusion. They spoke of clean bandages, quiet examinations, doctors who asked questions through interpreters, and touched injuries with professional distance, not cruelty. There were no interrogations disguised as treatment, no threats whispered behind closed doors, no mysterious injections, only basic care administered without commentary. Yet these reports did little to ease the fears of those who refused, because trust is not built through second-hand reassurance, and decades of conditioning do not dissolve after a single calm encounter. Among the prisoners was a man in his early 30s whose cough had grown steadily worse, a former mechanic whose lungs burned every night as if filled with ash. He had refused treatment twice, each time insisting that weakness was preferable to surrender, but by the third morning, he could barely stand in formation. The men around him watched closely, not out of concern alone, but because his decision would signal something important. And when his name was called again, and he did not step forward, no one mocked him, no one pressured him, and no guard intervened. The line simply moved on, leaving him standing there, breathing hard, as if the system had accepted his refusal without judgment. That was when the camp physician requested a meeting with the commanding officer, not to demand compliance, but to clarify responsibility. Under the rules governing the camp, medical care was not a privilege offered at discretion, nor a favor exchanged for obedience, but an obligation that did not disappear when refused. The question was not whether prisoners could decline treatment, but whether the camp could allow them to deteriorate knowingly. And the answer, written plainly in regulations that predated the war itself, was no. When word of this reached the barracks, it spread unevenly, distorted by rumor and fear, because prisoners heard only fragments, phrases like orders from above and mandatory care, and filled the gaps with their own expectations. Some believed force was coming, that guards would drag them to the infirmary, while others feared something subtler, a rule that would compel compliance without visible punishment, stripping choice away quietly rather than violently. That evening, an announcement was posted outside the barracks, brief and unemotional, stating that medical evaluations would proceed for all listed prisoners beginning the following morning, regardless of prior refusals, and that cooperation was expected. There were no threats attached, no mention of consequences, only the weight of inevitability carried in the language itself. As the lights dimmed and the camp settled into uneasy silence, many of the men realized that whatever rule governed this place had finally surfaced and that their resistance had not been ignored, only postponed, waiting for a moment when it could assert itself fully and without drama. When the morning came, the camp moved with an unusual stillness, because everyone understood that something subtle but irreversible was about to happen, not through force or punishment, but through procedure. The prisoners were assembled as usual, names read from the same lists. Yet this time the order carried a different weight, because it was no longer an invitation to report for care, but a process already in motion, one that did not pause to ask whether fear or belief stood in the way. The men were not dragged to the infirmary. No hands were raised, no voices sharpened. Instead, guards positioned themselves calmly along the route, not as enforcers but as guides, closing off alternatives without confrontation. Refusal, once possible, now dissolved into irrelevance, because the system did not argue with the prisoners, nor did it try to persuade them. It simply proceeded, treating medical examination as an administrative certainty rather than a choice to be debated. Inside the infirmary, the atmosphere contradicted everything many of the men had imagined. There were no locked doors behind them, no instruments prepared with theatrical menace, no sense that the space itself was hostile. Doctors worked methodically, calling names, recording symptoms, cleaning wounds, listening to lungs, writing notes. Interpreters translated questions without commentary, and the process unfolded with an efficiency that felt almost indifferent to fear, as if the prisoner's anxiety existed outside the room and held no relevance here. This indifference unsettled them more than cruelty would have. Pain could be endured, violence understood, but professionalism offered no clear enemy. The doctors did not lecture, threaten, or reassure. They did not demand gratitude or obedience. They acted as if the prisoners' bodies were simply bodies, subject to the same standards of care as any others under their responsibility. And this quiet normality left many unsure how to react. As examinations continued, the men noticed that no distinctions were made based on rank, behavior, or attitude. Those who had refused treatment earlier were not singled out or reprimanded. Their files were updated, their conditions treated, their refusals noted only as administrative details. The rule being enforced was not about compliance or discipline, but about obligation, and obligation, once triggered, moved forward without emotion. For some prisoners, the moment carried an unexpected sense of relief. Not relief from fear, which lingered, but relief from decision. The burden of choosing had been lifted without punishment, replaced by a process that required nothing but presence. They did not have to trust the doctors, nor did they have to resist them. The rule had decided on their behalf, and that clarity, however unsettling, removed the exhausting uncertainty that had defined the previous days. Others experienced something closer to disorientation. They had prepared themselves for confrontation, for resistance, for proof that their fears were justified, yet none of that materialized. The system did not confirm their expectations or challenge them directly. It simply ignored them, proceeding according to a logic that felt foreign because it did not rely on intimidation or ideology. By the time the last examinations were completed, the prisoners returned to the barracks quieter than before. No speeches had been made, no lessons declared, yet something fundamental had shifted. The refusal that once felt like an assertion of control now seemed small against a structure that neither punished nor rewarded it. The rule had not crushed their resistance. It had rendered it unnecessary. As the day settled and routine resumed, many of the men understood that the moment they feared most had passed without spectacle, leaving behind a realization that would take longer to process than any wound. The system governing their captivity did not need their consent to act, but also did not seek their submission through fear. It operated on principles they did not recognize, enforcing care not as kindness, but as requirement, and in doing so, it quietly dismantled the beliefs that had shaped their refusal in the first place. In the days that followed the examinations, the German prisoners began to sense that something had changed, not in the camp's rules or routines, but in how those rules felt when applied. The infirmary no longer carried the same symbolic weight it once had, because the feared moment had arrived and passed without confirming the stories they had brought with them into captivity. What remained was not trust, but confusion, and confusion lingered longer than fear ever had. Men compared their experiences cautiously, not trading details loudly, but sharing fragments in quiet moments. A remark about clean bandages, another about a doctor who spoke through an interpreter without impatience, another about medicine given without comment. None of these details were extraordinary on their own, yet together they formed a pattern that resisted the narratives the prisoners had relied on to make sense of the world. The treatment had not required gratitude, obedience, or cooperation beyond the unavoidable. It had simply happened. For some, this realization created a subtle unease. If medical care could be enforced without cruelty, without humiliation, and without ideological purpose, then the assumptions they had used to interpret captivity no longer applied cleanly. The camp was not behaving as an enemy should, at least not in the ways they had been taught to expect. This did not make the camp benevolent in their eyes, but made it unpredictable, and unpredictability unsettled them more deeply than open hostility. Others found themselves reconsidering the meaning of refusal itself. What had felt like resistance now appeared closer to misunderstanding, a reaction shaped by memory and instruction rather than present reality. The rule that compelled treatment had not been designed to assert dominance, but to prevent neglect, and that distinction mattered, even if it did not fully erase suspicion. The men realized that they had been refusing something that was never offered as a choice in the first place. This shift affected daily life in quiet ways. Complaints about pain or illness became less guarded, no longer treated as admissions of weakness. Men who had hidden injuries began to report them, not because they trusted the system fully, but because experience had shown that seeking care did not carry the consequences they had feared. The camp structure remained intact, yet the emotional tension surrounding medical treatment loosened, replaced by a cautious acceptance that not every rule was designed to break them. At the same time, the enforced care introduced a new kind of reflection. The prisoners began to understand that the rule governing treatment was not about compassion in the personal sense, but about responsibility imposed from above, a responsibility that did not disappear when resisted. The doctors had not healed them as an act of mercy, but because the law demanded it, and that realization complicated their understanding of power. Control, they saw now, did not always express itself through harm. Sometimes it appeared through obligation. As this understanding settled in, many of the men found themselves grappling with an uncomfortable question. If the camp could enforce care without cruelty, then where did the line between enemy and administrator truly lie? The answer was not clear, and the camp offered no explanation. The prisoners were left to sit with that ambiguity, aware that their captivity operated within a framework that did not align neatly with the categories they had brought with them. By the end of the week, the infirmary had become just another part of the camp's rhythm, stripped of its earlier menace yet never fully neutral. The rule that had changed everything had done so quietly, without spectacle or declaration, leaving the prisoners to absorb its implications on their own time. What they felt was not relief or gratitude, but a growing awareness that captivity under this system would continue to challenge not only their endurance, but the beliefs they relied on to interpret it. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of the refusal began to settle into the background of camp life, yet its effects continued to surface in subtle ways that the prisoners could not ignore. What had started as a collective hesitation became a quiet reference point, something remembered not for the fear it carried, but for how completely it had failed to unfold as expected. The rule that forced treatment had done more than move bodies through the infirmary. It had altered how the men understood the logic governing their captivity. The prisoners began to recognize that the system around them did not rely on breaking will through confrontation. Instead, it functioned by removing the illusion of choice where choice did not exist, replacing uncertainty with procedure. This realization was unsettling because it meant that resistance, at least in this form, was not met with punishment or negotiation, but with irrelevance. The camp did not need agreement, and it did not require fear to operate effectively. Some men felt a quiet resentment toward this structure, sensing that their refusal had been absorbed without acknowledgement, their fears addressed without apology. Others felt something closer to exhaustion, as if the effort of resisting had been unnecessary all along. The emotional energy they had spent anticipating cruelty had nowhere to go once cruelty failed to appear. What remained was a lingering discomfort, the sense that their expectations had been dismantled without being replaced by anything solid. In conversations that followed, the men spoke less about the doctors and more about the rule itself. They wondered how many other aspects of camp life were governed by obligations that did not bend to belief or ideology. Food distribution, work assignments, discipline, even correspondence followed patterns that did not respond to protest in the ways they understood. The medical rule became a symbol of something larger, a reminder that the camp's authority was rooted in regulation rather than impulse. This understanding influenced how the prisoners approached the future. When new orders arrived, there was less speculation about hidden motives and more attention paid to the structure behind them. Fear did not vanish, but it became more restrained, shaped by experience rather than imagination. The men learned to distinguish between what felt threatening and what simply felt unfamiliar, a skill that made endurance possible, even if it offered no comfort. For many, the most difficult part was accepting that the rule had not been designed to change their minds. It had not sought to teach them a lesson or correct their beliefs. It existed independently of their reactions, operating according to standards that did not require their understanding or approval. This absence of moral drama left them alone with their thoughts, forced to reconcile what they had expected with what had actually occurred. By the time the episode faded into routine, the prisoners realized that the refusal marked a turning point they had not anticipated. It was not a moment of defeat or submission, but a quiet adjustment, an acknowledgement that captivity here functioned through a logic that neither mirrored their training nor confirmed their fears. The rule that changed everything did so without ceremony, leaving behind a new awareness that survival would depend less on resistance and more on learning how to live within a system that refused to behave as expected. By the time the memory of the infirmary refusals finally lost their sharp edge, many of the German prisoners understood that what had unsettled them most was not the medical treatment itself, but the way it had been imposed without hostility, without negotiation, and without the need to prove anything. The rule that had forced the issue did not arrive as punishment or mercy, but as obligation, indifferent to fear and unmoved by belief. What lingered was a quiet realization that captivity in this place did not operate according to the logic they had prepared for. Power did not announce itself through violence, nor did it seek obedience through humiliation. It worked through procedures that continued regardless of resistance, leaving little space for drama or defiance. The refusal that once felt meaningful faded into something smaller, not because it was wrong, but because it had never truly mattered to the system enforcing the rule. Some prisoners later described this as humane, others as unsettling, and some struggled to describe it at all. The experience did not fit easily into the stories they had been taught to expect, and that discomfort stayed with them longer than fear ever had. Being cared for without consent forced them to confront an unfamiliar idea, that control could exist without cruelty, and that obligation could replace intimidation as a tool of authority. In the end, the rule that changed everything did not heal only wounds or prevent illness. It altered how the prisoners understood captivity itself. Survival here was not about resisting every order or trusting every gesture, but about recognizing a system that moved forward regardless of belief, leaving them to adapt not to kindness or brutality, but to a structure that demanded endurance without explanation. And long after the infirmary doors became just another part of the camp's routine, many remembered that moment as the first time they realized captivity in America would challenge not only their bodies, but the assumptions they had relied on to make sense of power, obedience, and survival. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.